All right. Next, we have James Radl from OSU. He is a PhD graduate student at The Ohio State University in the Department of Entomology, and he's working with Dr. Sarah Short. His current research focuses on understanding what factors affect where mosquitoes can successfully breed in central Ohio. And he's going to be speaking about mosquitoes in stormwater, ponds, and wetlands.
All right, thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for taking the time to listen to my presentation today. So I'm really excited to get the chance to talk to you all about one of the projects that I've been working on for my PhD. Okay, so we all know that mosquitoes are a problem in Ohio. I think that's why most of us are here. So we know that mosquitoes are an important medical pest, so they transmit diseases like West Nile and lacrosse. But I also wanted to highlight a couple other things. So they are still an important veterinary pest as well, and can transmit things like Eastern equine encephalitis and dog heartworm. So heartworm in particular, I think is oftentimes overlooked, but we still have over 100,000 cases of this. This problem in just the U.S. alone. And sometimes these diseases, especially with Eastern equine encephalitis, we see that occasionally in humans as well, which can be a problem. And finally, I wanted to mention too that mosquitoes are also a very important nuisance pest. I like this one article by Halasa et al. Because it does a good job of quantifying some of the negative impacts that mosquitoes have on things like a quality of life or impeding outdoor activities and stuff like that. So it is a very important nuisance pest as well. So one of the ways that we control mosquitoes is by finding where their larvae can live and develop, and either eliminating those habitats or making them less suitable for larvae to develop in them. So that brings me to the question of where do mosquito larvae develop? So mosquitoes, as I think most of us know, are aquatic as larvae, so they require some amount of standing water to develop. And I found in an interesting article by Irwin et al. That actually took a look at all of the surface standing water in the city of Madison, Wisconsin, which is nearby to here. And they actually quantified all the different standing water or surface water habitats and classified them. And one interesting result from this is that actually over 75% of the surface water in Madison is actually from man-made constructed ponds and ditches as well. So that makes me wonder, like, why are we building these ponds if we know they have the potential to breed mosquitoes? And these ponds and ditches are actually important parts of the stormwater control measures that cities build. So I think some of you may be very familiar with stormwater control measures, but some people may be less so. So I wanted to just give a brief introduction to what these are. So in cities, we have large amounts of impervious surfaces from things like buildings, parking lots, and roadways. And when we get a large amounts of rainfall in cities, the rainfall can pick up pollutants and some debris from these areas. And if we don't have any other kind of control for them, these usually get dumped directly into our larger bodies of water, like rivers and lakes. But more recently, cities have been requiring a lot of places to build stormwater control measures where this polluted water can actually funnel into these areas, and then some of the pollutants can be removed and the water can be actually released in a more controlled flow into these larger bodies of water. So that should help with things like flooding as well. Now, there's many different kinds of stormwater control measures, but in general, they have the same, most of them have a similar design where they consist of a large basin, which will fill up with water when we have large amounts of rainfall. When this water is actually ponded in basins like this, some of the debris and pollutants can actually settle out, which helps remove them. And then at this point, we can control the amount or the flow rate of water out of these as well. And many of these actually, again, dump back into those larger bodies of water. However, when we do have permanent standing water, like you can see in these basins, this does occasionally produce mosquitoes as well, which can be a problem in itself. So as I mentioned, there are several different kinds of stormwater control measures. We have some classic versions like the retention ponds and detention ponds, which are very common across the United States and in many other parts of the world. We've also been seeing an increase in other types of stormwater control measures, such as constructed wetlands, infiltration basins, bioretention cells, and even green roofs. And some of these, in particular, the three that I show at the bottom, these are designed to actually drain almost completely within just a few days. And so they should be, for the most part, dry throughout most of the season and not hold water long enough for mosquitoes to develop. However, other versions like these do oftentimes have enough water to, or hold water long enough to be able to have larvae go through their full development. So these three at the top are going to be the ones that I'm going to focus on for my project today. So my main question was, are there certain types of these SCMs, like between the three that I just showed, that actually produce fewer mosquitoes than others? And beyond that, we expected there to be a lot of variation between specific sites, and so I wanted to ask the question, are there particular environmental characteristics of these different sites that are associated with fewer mosquitoes? So to address this question, we conducted a field survey experiment in the summers of 2021 and 2022. We identified 30 different locations from around the Columbus or Franklin County area. And these 30 sites were divided into those three different types. So retention ponds, detention ponds, and constructed wetlands. And so just to go over these very briefly, so retention ponds are kind of your typical pond that you would think of. These ones are usually dug pretty deep and because of this hold usually a large volume of water permanently. Detention ponds are similar to retention ponds, however these ones typically drain almost completely over time. And they only hold usually a small volume of water, usually around the inlet and around the outlet. So I like this picture here because it shows a good example of a detention pond. So this whole area is actually a basin, and you can see the emergency overflow here. So again, this whole area can fill up with water when necessary, but it really just pools a little bit of water right at that bottom where the vegetation is. And constructed wetlands are also similar to retention ponds. However, these ones are typically a bit shallower, kind of throughout the entire SCM, and they're also oftentimes sinuous. So this one kind of winds around in that image there. And also, unlike the other two types of SCMs, these ones are usually intentionally planted with vegetation. So the other ones oftentimes have just like grass or something like that around the edges, but these ones usually are planted with specific native vegetation as well. All right, so I just wanted to talk very briefly about what like my collection supplies. So this is an image of the supplies that I use to go collecting mosquitoes around these SCMs. So in particular, we stopped at 10 different locations around each of the individual locations at 9 different times throughout the year. And we stopped at 10 different times for the retention ponds and the wetlands, and then only 4 times for the detention ponds. That's because they hold a lot less water. And so we were really just collecting 2 samples at the inlet and 2 samples at the outlet. So wherever we collected the samples, we used just kind of a standard larval dipper. We collected 3 cups of water and poured them into these plastic bins. And with those, we could look very closely at the water. And whenever we found any larvae in those, we extracted them out with an eyedropper and put them in specimen cups. And from there, we could take those specimen cups back to the lab and identify them to species. Also, while we were out there, we also used water quality equipment to measure a few different characteristics of the water. So that included temperature, pH, conductivity, and turbidity. And we also made a qualitative assessment of the vegetation, both within the water itself as well as adjacent to the water, so on land, and also an assessment of shade. And all these variables were written down on our data sheet for evaluation. All right, so I'm going to go through a few different results here. So this is basically a table of all of the species we found in the different categories. So you see we've got RP for retention ponds, DP for detention ponds, and the W for wetlands, and then a total along the edge. And we have all the different taxa that we collected here. So I would point out that we found basically 10 different species or taxa in our samples. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of these. Particularly the most common ones. So first of all, we have Culex territans. Now, I think this is probably one of the species that is talked about less often, so maybe many of us probably aren't too familiar with it. And I think the reason for that is because it is innocuous to humans. So as far as we can tell, it feeds primarily on things like reptiles and amphibians. And because it doesn't bite people or even like pets and livestock and stuff like that, it's not really considered a nuisance pest or a vector pest. But that was the most dominant species that we have here, and you can actually see that it's very common, especially in the wetlands, but also not uncommon in the other two sites as well. All right. However, with our second species, this is Culex pipiens, and I'm sure most of us are familiar with this one. So this is the one that is considered the main vector of West Nile in our region of the country, and has also been implicated with vectoring other diseases as well. So this one was found pretty commonly in our samples. I did want to mention Anopheles here real quick. So we found at least a couple different species of Anopheles, but the keys that we were using, we weren't able to separate these consistently to species, so we just grouped them all together. However, I would mention that for the most part, we expect these to be consisting of Anopheles, quadrimaculatus, punctopenis, and perplexus, just like Hannah mentioned in our last presentation. So. These ones I do want to mention that Anopheles in general are one of the main vectors for heartworm, so they are important on that aspect, but as Hannah went over in the last presentation, they also are malaria vectors in the United States. So especially Anopheles quadrimaculatus is one that does spread malaria in the Western Hemisphere, and things like punctopenis have been thought to have done that in the past as well, even though we don't have malaria throughout most of the United States right now. I also wanted to highlight Aedes vexans here because this is, I think, one of our most important nuisance pests, not only in Ohio, in the United States, but also across most of the world. So this species has been implicated with the transmission of some diseases. It's not thought to be a primary vector of any real diseases of concern in Ohio, but it has been shown to have the potential to vector a lot of different diseases. And it is more of a primary vector in other places like Europe and Asia. However, this one is a very aggressive biter, so it does tend to prefer mammalian blood. It will bite people very aggressively, even in the middle of the day, whereas most of the other species tend to bite at night. So yeah, it's an important nuisance pest, if nothing else. All right, so I wanted to go into some of the results from the different site types here, and I thought the best way to visualize this is by looking at a heat map. So what you see here is each one of these different columns represents our different site types, so retention ponds, detention ponds, and wetlands again, and we have all the species that I had on the previous slide. And so wherever you see an intersection between the species and the site type, it shows the color of the block there shows the correlation between those two things. So where you see a very like dark red, that indicates a very strong positive correlation between that species and that type. And where you see a dark blue, that's a strong negative correlation between that species and that type. And some of the blocks that are more kind of a pale yellow color have a weak or no correlation to them. So looking at retention ponds in particular, these ones in general were negatively correlated with mosquitoes. So if you look at the total mosquitoes overall, you have a pretty negative correlation there. So that means that in general, these ones had fewer mosquitoes than the other types of sites. But you do see Culex radicus and our Anopheles species are somewhat positive in these sites. But in general, they had not very many mosquitoes. For detention ponds, they also didn't have as many mosquitoes as wetlands, but we do see a much stronger correlation with, in particular, Culex pipiens here and Aedes vexans here. So again, those are going to be our important vector and nuisance species, and so I wanted to highlight that with detention ponds in particular. And just one kind of general observation that we made that I thought was kind of interesting is that with these sites in particular, it seemed that some of the sites you would go to would have no mosquitoes, and then other sites would have a very high number of mosquitoes. And that sometimes actually varied by date as well. So you go there 1 week and collect 0, and then the next week you'd have 100 mosquitoes. And that seemed to be very characteristic of detention ponds, but not so much with the other ones. All right, so finally with wetlands, I don't think this is too surprising, but wetlands in general were very positively correlated with mosquitoes, especially overall. So I just wanted to mention that we did conduct a zero-altered generalized linear mixed model to test this hypothesis and to kind of very basically explain what we're doing here. This model will test the effect of site type as a predictor of, well, first of all, whether mosquitoes are going to be present or absent in each of our individual samples, and then second of all, when mosquitoes are present, like how high that abundance is. And overall, it did find that site type is predictive of when mosquitoes are found versus when they're not found, but not in terms of if they are found, their overall abundance. And in particular, this just showed us that wetlands are more often going to be harboring larvae than detention ponds and retention ponds. So kind of like our overall results, these ones are dominated in particular by Culex territans that you can see at the top there, which is our innocuous species. But they actually do overall harbor all 10 of our different taxa. So the other groups were missing some species, but wetlands we did find all 10 different taxa in wetlands. And overall, we did also test the amount of mosquito diversity between our sites using the Shannon index. And we did find that wetlands in general hold a higher diversity of mosquitoes, which is not too surprising. And so onto our question about environmental characteristics. So this heat map is similar to the last one, except instead of having the 3 different types, we have our 7 different environmental characteristics that we measured, and the same species along here. So again, if we look at the darkest red things here, we'll see that total mosquitoes seem to be very positively correlated with the vegetation in the water, the vegetation on land, and the amount of shade that the sites had. And I think this is really well pictured with our retention ponds. So what you can see here is in the top image, this was the retention pond that had the most larvae collected throughout both years. And the one on the bottom actually had 0 mosquitoes collected throughout all of the 2 years. And I think one of the things that kind of jumps out when you're just looking at these images is the amount of vegetation, particularly right at the interface between where the water is and where the edge of the land is. So in the top picture, you can see kind of tall vegetation. There's also some like algae growing in the water, and on the other hand, on the bottom image, there is really almost no vegetation right where the water meets the land. There's actually like a rock border, and in some cases, the grass goes all the way up to the edge of the water, but there's no tall vegetation. And there's almost no algae in that pond as well. So I did want to mention that the retention ponds are generally not planted with vegetation, as I mentioned earlier. However, we do sometimes see invasive plants like cattails and common reeds that actually establish within these sites that can be somewhat difficult to control. And I think this oftentimes leads to some of the increase in vegetation that we see with these sites, even though this is not necessarily intentional. And we actually see this even more in our detention ponds as well. So this is one of the examples of a detention pond. And you can only barely see it, but there's actually an inlet to the SEM right there. And this whole kind of bottom area right there is where the water is supposed to be. And as you can see, it's completely overgrown with cattails. And that was not uncommon in some of the sites that we saw. Here's another example of a detention pond. And I think what's kind of interesting about this one is that this one actually had a large amount of water basically pooled the entire time. So again, detention ponds are usually only supposed to have a small amount of water at most at the inlets and outlets, but this one was full of water. And I think part of the reason for this could be because the outflow, it was blocked and not flowing out as well. But we also saw that sort of thing in a few of our different sites. And lastly, I also like this image. This was one detention pond that had a lot of our Aedes vexins. So I'm not sure if the reason for this is because there's some debris near the outlet here, which is causing a backflow of water. But in this particular one, we did have some water that was in these sites for a bit of time. And this, again, this type of habitat seemed to work really well for Aedes vexins. And we found a lot of the Aedes vexins at that site. All right, so I just wanted to kind of summarize a couple main conclusions from this. So overall, wetlands did harbor the most mosquitoes and the highest diversity of mosquitoes. So this includes both some of our harmful species as well as our harmless species, in particular like Culex territans, which was the main species found at those sites. Detention ponds, on the other hand, typically had fewer mosquitoes overall or less often, But the mosquitoes that were found there tended to be the more important ones, so like our nuisance and vector species. And finally, vegetation seems to be a main variable that is positively correlated with mosquitoes. And so again, some of the vegetation that we see may not really be intentional, but we do see like invasive plants or overgrown plants in a lot of these sites, and that may be leading to a higher number of mosquitoes found in these sites. All right, so with that, I just wanted to acknowledge quickly the labs of Sarah Short, my advisor, Dr. Ryan Winston, and Dr. Kayla Perry, who helped with the statistics on this project. I wanted to thank the Ohio State University Infectious Diseases Institute and the College of Food, Agricultural, and Environmental Sciences for providing funding for this project, and in particular, all the property managers and owners who allowed us to use their land for this project. And if I have some time, I'd like to take any questions that you guys have. Yeah, go ahead.
This is just kind of a random question, but your environmental factors that you use, like your pH, your temperature, your productivity, your humidity, according to the one graph towards the end, did you find like pH and conductivity and like the turbidity affected less than?
Yes. Yeah. So there were some things like temperature was negatively correlated and pH were negative correlated. So that kind of means that acidic pH and lower temperatures were correlated with mosquitoes. But that was a weaker correlation than the positive correlations that we saw with like vegetation and shade. Is that what you're asking?
No, it isn't. I was just curious, how did you, just as far as water goes, are those just normal things that you use for factors?
You mean, why did we choose those 7 as opposed to all the rest of them? Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so some of them have been correlated with mosquitoes in the past. In fact, I think if you look for it, you could probably find papers with all of them mentioned at some point or another. There's really a lot of different factors that really could influence mosquitoes, and I think overall our correlations were moderately weak, which kind of indicates that there's probably a lot more factors out there. I think realistically these were ones that we had the equipment for, and so we thought those would be a good choice. We really wanted to test things like vegetation because we've seen, like in previous papers, that people have correlated things like cattails especially and reeds with mosquitoes. So yeah, it's kind of a combination of we thought they were useful and we had the equipment to measure it. So.
Just like for, somebody who's going out, I mean, obviously I would be drawn to something with vegetation and, just when you get out doing these things, you just get accustomed to, oh, this would be a good spot. So when I saw like it was different, I'm like, can mosquitoes really care about the pH in the water?
Yeah, I mean, so there's the possibility of that, and it's also the possibility that those variables are confounded. So certainly when you look at something like shade and vegetation, maybe they don't really care about shade, maybe they care about vegetation, but because there's vegetation, you're probably going to get shade. So the two kind of combine together. So, yeah. Yeah.
I'm a little surprised at your wetlands that being established under water here. Could there be a population of water beetles, other aquatic insects that would feed off of mosquito larvae? Is there a conclusion like researcher was looking at?
Well, just because they're feeding on them doesn't mean that they're completely eliminating them, right? So some of the like ponds, I would say just kind of from my own observation, those had almost no arthropods in them, I guess. Whereas like something like the wetlands, again, like you're saying, are full of lots of different things, not just mosquitoes, but sometimes predators and stuff like that. And so I think that you're looking potentially at the difference between things that like don't have a very large amount of larvae versus ones that have like almost no larvae. But it's kind of hard to, I guess, to kind of compare those. The other thing I would mention too is that what we did see in some cases with wetlands is that when the waters would rise and then lower again, you would actually get like little pockets of water. And sometimes those pockets are just full of mosquitoes because you don't have those other like aquatic things that could be feeding on them. But I believe in other literature they have looked at like more specific species of predators and have found that yeah, I guess I don't remember the exact results, but they have looked at correlations between mosquitoes and particular like predators.
species? And if there was a variety, were there any is there a seed mating correlation with ones that got along well, or like ones that you find frequently together?
That's a really interesting question. And I think that's one that we probably need to statistically analyze to really answer it well. I would say from my own observation, there were certainly particular sites that seemed to harbor lots of different diversity. So like each individual scoop, you'd get out like 5 different species. That would not be too surprising. And on the other hand, you'd go to other sites, like especially with the detention ponds, in some of those sites, you'd scoop out 100 larvae, and all 100 would be like Aedes vexans or Culex pipiens. Yeah. So again, I think it's kind of going to be tied to the SCM type. So.
I thought you more retention ponds with detention ponds was a larger source of water versus like a small pocket outside of a wetland, right?
Yeah, it could be. I think the detention ponds kind of had some of those pockets as well. So, but yeah, it could be. Yeah.
Really interesting stuff, James. Thank you. Question about retention ponds. So, the difference between the pictures that you showed, one looked really, really maintained, and the other one looked, maybe not so much. I can speak to a couple of retention ponds near us. They're stocked with green sunfish, another predator, and they keep the things at bay. Do you, anecdotally, do you believe that vegetation contributes more than a lack of predators? As far as the differences between the sites.
I would say I'm not sure I could really comment too much on that because we really didn't look at predators. I kind of feel like in general, we didn't see a whole lot of predators from our observations in these different sites, but I imagine that really is going to depend a lot on the individual sites, especially if they're being like introduced intentionally into them. Some of the research that I've seen on vegetation is that like you can evaluate different types of vegetation for like which like species of either animals or other potential predators, mosquitoes, things like fish and stuff like that. So they actually have like correlations between those. So like some plant species are supposed to be better for like mosquitoes, or not better, but like help create an environment that's more conducive to development for larvae, whereas other ones are going to be better for like different types of predators to them. And so actually, I think just the difference in the different types of vegetation may really make a big difference. Like we just evaluated vegetation overall. We didn't actually look at the different species of vegetation, but that's certainly something that I think could be important. So, yeah.
So the developers that you were in and you presented these results to them, I'm guessing, did you share? I just was curious if they were like, oh, snap, I should probably rethink my wetlands idea for the next project.
Yeah, so actually, to be honest, we have not really talked to any of the land managers. I think some of them either may not want to know or don't really care. Yeah, so we're working on publishing our results with each of the sites, kind of like anonymously in there. But I think we're going to probably present this to some of the people that did allow us to use their sites. So I would be very curious on what they thought. I think, with some things, like I talked to directly to one of the people that actually a couple different people that installed some of the wetlands, and they don't seem to be particularly concerned about mosquitoes. I think it's kind of almost assumed that if they are building wetlands, there's going to be mosquitoes there because they are just enhancing kind of the overall wildlife that's there, and mosquitoes just kind of come with that territory. I think some people, like, especially if you're looking at some of these detention ponds that have hundreds of mosquitoes, I think those are probably going to be the owners that might be a little bit surprised by some of those results. So. Mm-hmm.